This week we're going to be reading A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. It's not a difficult text per se, but it is dense, and it's been characterized by some of my students as grim or depressing. I tend to agree with them. The story begins innocently enough, with the family embarking on a vacation. After some disagreement between Bailey and his mother over the destination of the trip, they finally set off to Florida. Everyone packed into one car, and the family has to suffer through the grandmother's idle chatter the whole time through. Rumors abound of a killer on the loose named the Misfit, but even though the conclusion is staring us in the face, we have no reason to believe that the family is in any real danger. When the grandmother pleads against going to Florida because she fears they'll run into the Misfit, we expect this is just a case of the grandmother being manipulative and attempting to guilt her son into doing what she wants to do. After all, the narrator tells us that the grandmother makes a note of the mileage on the odometer because she wants to compare this reading to the one she'll take when they get back, hardly the actions of one who is convinced she won't make it back alive. As the family commences on their trip, we begin to learn more about them, but specifically we learn the most about the grandmother, as she starts to assert herself as the protagonist of this story by, initially, the sheer virtue of talking the most. She talks about the good old days, scolds the children for acting impolite, points out the various features in the scenery, and fantasizes about her youth. The grandmother has a deep appreciation for her Southern heritage, and when her grandson remarks that Georgia and Tennessee are hillbilly dumping grounds, she sternly rebukes him for having no respect for his home state. At one point, the grandmother, overcome by nostalgia, decides that she wants to visit a plantation she remembers from her youth, and she manipulates the family into taking a short detour to see it. Bailey is not one to be driven off course, but the grandmother has gotten the children excited about the plantation, so he really doesn't have a choice but to acquiesce. It is during this detour, however, that the grandmother suddenly realizes that she has misremembered the location of the plantation. It is not in Georgia, but in Tennessee. Ironically, the grandmother, who has been idealizing the past this entire time through, has been betrayed by her memory, and the force of this realization startles her enough to cause a car accident as she quite literally lets the cat out of the bag. It isn't long before the humor of the incident, however, transforms into horror, for the ditch they find themselves in will set this family up for an encounter with the Misfit and his henchmen. The Misfit is a man who justifies his name in more ways than one. He wears clothes that don't fit, leading one to believe that he pilfered these clothes from a previous victim, and perhaps has a habit of changing his look to evade authorities. Of course, the other characterization of his name matches equally well. He is an outcast from society, one who feels like he never quite fit in. In his own words, "My daddy said I was a different breed of dog from my brothers and sisters. You know," Daddy said, "it's some that can live their whole life out without asking about it, and it's others has to know why it is, and this boy is one of the latters. He's going to be into everything." Page 422. The family are marshaled into the woods to be dealt with, leaving the grandmother alone with the Misfit. She makes numerous appeals, first to his goodness, which he denies because he is not a good man, and second to his religion, which he denies because he says he doesn't need any help. We learn that the Misfit is dealing with his own crisis of faith, so to speak, and even though he is a man who could tell the difference between right and wrong, he believes he was wronged by the system for miscarriage of justice. On page 424 he says, "I can't make what all I done wrong fit what all I gone through in punishment." Ultimately, the grandmother's appeals are to no avail. Her meeting with the Misfit was, in hindsight, inevitable due to the many clues in the text, and perhaps so is her own tragic end. Close readers might find some similarities between A Rose for Emily and A Good Man is Hard to Find. Both texts are considered to be examples of Southern Gothic literature and build this tension between past and present. For instance, if Emily is considered to be a descendant of the old elite, the grandmother in A Good Man seems to represent a yearning for a return to her glory days. I think this sentiment is best described by this line from A Rose for Emily. The very old men, some in their brushed Confederate uniforms, on the porch in the lawn, were talking of Miss Emily as if she had been a contemporary of theirs, believing that they had danced with her and courted her perhaps, confusing time with its mathematical progression as the old do, to whom all the past is not a diminishing road, but, instead, a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottleneck of the most recent decade of years. Page 315. The idea of painting the past as a perfect but unattainable ideal is heavily echoed in A Good Man is Hard to Find, so much so that we can almost regard the short story as a treatise on the moral decay of Southern, even perhaps American society. But in order to see it this way, we need to become sympathetic to the grandmother's views and opinions, because she is, after all, the protagonist of the story, and she acts as a sort of moral compass. And as we move forward to talk about the grandmother's morals, it's important to acknowledge that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to detach one's own opinions and morals from a reading. This is because literature is open to a reader's interpretation, and we, as the readers, belong to greater societies and cultures that dictate our social and moral norms, just as Flannery O'Connor belonged to hers. Therefore, what we may see as repulsive in a character may have just been the norm in another person's life, and what we view as the norm in our lifetimes will possibly be regarded as deviant or offensive by future generations. This is not to say, however, that the text itself is totally devoid of its own moral character. Certainly, A Good Man is Hard to Find is very much a tale about morals, good, bad, whatever, and there are a few different methods we can use to understand the guiding moral principles of the story. The first method is to subject it to biographical or historical criticism. We know that Flannery O'Connor was a deeply religious woman, for instance, who, growing up Catholic in Protestant Georgia, might have felt like an outsider for her faith. She finds comfort in only her faith, and if we let this outlook inform our reading, then we can begin to see the story as a tale of Christian redemption and salvation. After all, the grandmother's final act is an act of redemption. It is the sole instance in the text of her letting go of her biases, prejudices, and judgments. She stands before the misfit, a robber and a murderer, a man who preys on the weak and innocent. He is a bad man, but he is also a good man, not because, as the grandmother says, he doesn't have a drop of common blood in his body, but because he brings about her salvation. The grandmother cries at the end of the text, "Why, you're one of my babies, you're one of my own children." In her final moment, she is shot down by the misfit, but not before receiving salvation, for she is freed of all those biases and prejudices she had held in. On this note, O'Connor says, "Writers who see by the light of their Christian faith will have, in these times, the sharpest eyes for the grotesque, for the perverse, and for the unacceptable. Redemption is meaningless unless there is a cause for it in the actual life we live. Indeed, A Good Man is Hard to Find can be ugly and grotesque, savage, but even in the most vile of circumstances we can find the light of redemption." The narrator references this on page 414. The trees were full of silver-white sunlight, and the meanest of them sparkled. The meanest of them. In some strange way, perhaps there is good yet in the misfit. Another way to uncover the moral principle of the story is to let the story speak for itself, reveal its own morals through the way it treats the tension of opposites. After all, morals themselves are about the tension of opposites, what we should do versus what we shouldn't. The binary nature of morals, how they divide practices or behaviors into good or bad, acceptable or unacceptable, lends itself to a discussion of the binary nature of the story itself. Let's use the grandmother as an example. Think of some words that best represent the character. How about this one? Past. As a member of the older generation, the grandmother believes that she has witnessed Southern society at its apex, and feels that the modern times represent a decline in American values and culture. She longs for a return to her glory days, and hatches a conspiracy to get the family off track from their vacation to visit an old house from her past. Ladylike. Beyond the facile observation that the grandmother, of course, is a woman, there is a deeper cultural meaning to the word lady. It is one thing to be a woman, and another to be, in the grandmother's estimation, a lady. The former is a biological classification. The latter is a cultural one, and carries strong social connotations. The grandmother dresses a certain way because, if she's ever discovered dead on the side of the road, the narrator quips, there will be no questioning that she was first and foremost a lady. Wealth. This is not to say that the grandmother herself, mind you, is wealthy, but you'll notice that there is a certain privileging of wealth in the story. We see this in the way that the grandmother reminisces about a wealthy suitor from her past, Mr. Edgar Atkins Teagarden, and we see this in the way that the grandmother pleads that the misfit is a good man because he doesn't possess any common or lower class blood. If all these things represent what is good in the eyes of the grandmother, then their opposites must represent what is bad or what is wrong with society. The moral principle, therefore, is something that is innate within the work. There is no need for the biography of the author. The meaning is built in, internal, and it's our job to uncover it. As we move forward this semester, This business of ordering things into binary pairs and discussing the tension of opposites will be used to delve deeper into our texts. The technique is called binary opposition, and it dates back to the work of the structuralists, who argued that we can only know more about something by understanding what it is not. Without getting too wrapped up into the theory of the technique, this is essentially how it works.